Imagine a typical department meeting. Let's say there's even an agenda. Most agendas are a list of topics. Let's say new hiring policy, new software, conference room getting painted. So let's talk about the new hiring policy agenda item. The chair of the meeting jumps right in by discussing the topic, which is that we're all going to have to change how screening interviews are done for our new hires. And they're talking about the software, and they're talking about the script, and they're talking about whatever. What they're not talking about is what is the purpose of the topic? Why are we discussing the new hiring policy? Is the goal to all agree on the new hiring policy? Or has it already been decided and our goal is to inform everybody of the new hiring policy, and through informing them in this synchronous meeting, hope that everybody is going to follow the policy? Or is the point of it to discuss it and put it out there and get some input on the new hiring policy? All these intentions and goals are so rarely discussed when we bring up an agenda item. And today's focus is going to be how different the world could be if people knew why we were bringing things up. Welcome back to Curious Now. I'm Jenny Rudolph. Let's look at another very typical example of this. Think of a performance review you've got to lead or you're going to have, or a feedback conversation you've got to lead or you're participating in, or a debriefing after a simulation that you're leading or you're participating in. The most common way to approach these conversations is with two kinds of questions. One is open-ended questions to find out what the person in the feedback conversation is thinking, if I'm the leader. And so I might say something like, hey, I'm really interested to get your take on how the last quarter went. So this apparently benign question is okay, but why am I asking it? Especially consider that if I'm leading the performance review or I'm leading the feedback conversation, I'm probably the person with the power in that relationship. So, what is the proper answer to that question? Alternately, the other kind of question we ask in performance review, feedback conversations, or debriefings is a question like, don't you think it would have been better to get that sales report out on time? Or did you have any concerns about the patient's high blood pressure? These questions have an answer that I, the questioner, have in mind, and therefore we often think of them as guess what I'm thinking questions. Again, the problem is, what is the listener supposed to make of the question? What is the point of the question? Is the question indeed a test? Like, I think how you managed the blood pressure was problematic. I think getting the sales report out late was problematic, but I want to see if you agree with me. Or is there some other goal to the question? Often, with those first kind of open ended questions, which I'm going to call naked inquiries, or the guess what I'm thinking questions, actual good could come of them if only the listener knew why we were asking. So let me give some alternatives here. Imagine that staff meeting or that department meeting started with, hey, gang, we're going to be talking about the new hiring policy today. I know it's been rolled out already, and I know that a lot of people are having some problems with it. So we have the opportunity to tweak it a little bit over the next couple months and make it better so it works for all of us. So my goal today is to get your input on that. And I have to tell you, I am ultimately going to be the decider on whether we're going to be able to implement your suggestions or not. But I am going to take them on board because I really want this to be as good for all of us as possible. So notice I've done two things there in previewing essentially what is the point of the discussion. One is, what do I need from you all? And I also did a super radical thing, which is I said, the decision making process is I'm going to take on board what you're giving me and I'm going to decide. Another decision making process could be voting, another could be consensus. But often when we're in meetings or high stakes conversations or even low stakes conversations, nobody knows what is the decision making process that the power person is going to use. Let's take a look at those guess what I'm thinking questions and those naked inquiries. So let's just say I ask the person, hey, how do you feel the last quarter went? Imagine how different that might land if I said, hey, listen, we're going to be thinking together about how I can best support you in doing your job. And also, I'm going to be making some suggestions about ways you might improve your job. To start that, though, I know what I think, but I don't know what you think. So I'd really like to get a sense of your take on how the last quarter went. So I've shared a typical, albeit perhaps nightmarish scenario of a department meeting we've all been in. I've shared the kind of uh, experience of a naked inquiry and the experience of a guess what I'm thinking question. What I'd like to do now is talk about why those are important to change. And the way I'm going to talk about it is with a concept called the preview. I'm going to be talking about how we can lead off a meeting, a part of a conversation, a part of a debriefing by signaling what is coming next. To me, one of the most important and interesting things about previewing is how it can level the playing field power dynamic wise. If you are the person in charge of a meeting, if you are the person in charge of leading a feedback conversation, if you're the person in charge of leading a debriefing conversation, chances are you have more formal power than the other people in the room. And when you make other people guess what you're thinking, when other people don't know where you're headed, the impact on them is to have to do more work to try to follow you and to potentially feel kind of insecure and uncertain about what's happening because they don't yet know the rules of the game. They don't yet know the direction that they're going. Let's say I'm in a debriefing conversation and we've been talking about how do we manage an allergic reaction that can be kind of intense called anaphylaxis that a patient has during a procedure. And now I want to change the conversation and talk a little bit about how do we manage the family who's also in the room. So, family presence. So, a preview in that case would be something like, hey, we've been talking about what are the first line and second line treatments for anaphylaxis. Now I'd like to pivot and I want to talk about how do we help the family member stay in the loop while something like this is going on. Why is this so powerful for people? Decades of research in my field, organizational behavior, finds that if you don't signal where you're headed and what you're doing, people, especially those with less power than you, are going to be trying desperately to figure that out. And instead of working on the problem at hand, they're trying to guess what is the right answer. They're trying to guess how not to make you angry. They're trying to guess how to please you. And instead, all that cognitive load can be shifted off the table, or a lot of it, by being transparent, by which I mean sharing your thinking and making it visible about what you're thinking. We humans are wired to try to make sense of things. So when there's ambiguity, whether it's intellectual ambiguity or power ambiguity, like, am I going to get in trouble if I don't get this right? We furiously start doing something called sense making. And this is a really rich vein, again, from my field of organizational behavior, led originally by a guy named Carl Weick, which draws on also decades of research on how we as humans try to make sense of reality. And so when there's ambiguity, people are trying to figure things out instead of get on the same bus with you to solve the problem that you think is the important problem. The last thing that previewing can kind of prevent is people just veering wildly off course about what you are intending or where you are headed. And so another metaphor from my field is the ladder of inference. And that is, I see what you're saying, or I hear what you're saying, or I see what you're doing, but you're not really explaining why. So I'm going to run up the ladder of inference and decide for myself why you're doing something. And that often is wrong. And so again, we're wasting the other human's time in our meetings and our feedback conversations with them doing all this sense making, with them doing all this running up the ladder of inference that could be used better to do the problem solving or the invention or the creation that is the point of our getting together at that moment. So I just want to end this bit of conversation with you by returning to the concept of power. James Lipshaw, our producer, and I were talking a little bit about this before the show. And James, I was, saying how I tend to lose my mind when I feel manipulated or I feel like somebody has an agenda that they're not disclosing. And I certainly recognize that the level of triggered that I get with that, is probably, disproportionate to the moment, and I know, when it's hysterical, it's historical, so I'm certainly working on whatever those issues are for me, but I think that sense of unfairness that drives me in those moments is part of the fuel that makes me so passionate about previewing in particular, but advocacy, inquiry, and these conversational skills, and um, I'm just wondering, what goes through your mind around the kind of power aspects of this?
Yeah, all we were saying, Jenny, was just this idea that, people at the top of these power hierarchies in relationships, professionally or personally, tend to have a blind spot for when this sort of thing is happening, but when you're on the other side of it, you feel it really acutely. I can just think of, a number of situations where I might have had a supervisor come into a room and say, "I just want to observe you while you're doing something." I just wanna watch. And I think everyone listening can imagine has experienced that or can imagine how that feels, how, like, even just walking around the room is suddenly this overthought, overwrought process because you're so cognitively overloaded just by the presence of this person with power who isn't even saying anything, although the not saying anything is worse in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Or like, "Hey, James, I've heard you've got a great new way of managing classroom, management or doing classroom management, and a couple other teachers have mentioned it to me. I just wanna come in and see what you're doing." How different does that land than, mysteriously coming in? All right, James, well, let's move on to our workout of the week. What we would like to offer you this week is the chance to practice previewing. You can practice it in your emails. And this is wonderful because you don't have to think on your feet in the same way. Instead of having fairly nondescript subject lines in your emails, practice your preview skills there. So, example, instead of saying something like sales report in the subject line or resident interviews in the subject line, you could put in your subject line something like requesting your review of the sales report or share your point of view on the new criteria for selecting residents. So obviously, these are slightly longer subject lines, but all of a sudden the recipient knows, hey, what am I going to be asked when I open this email? And I think this kind of subject line hygiene can really transform a team's efficiency and productivity because I think we've all had that experience of it's the 20th email that started with a very random different subject and it's still got the same topic and now you have to read through to the bottom to figure out what are they asking of you. So practice your previewing by practicing subject lines in an email. Thank you for joining me on Curious Now, and I'd love to hear about how the workout of the week goes for you.